They threw everything they had, and we burned it all down. Lieutenant Commander Jake Radar Morrison pressed his headset tighter against his ear as another wave of contacts bloomed across his scope like deadly flowers. The Combat Information Center aboard the USS Intrepid hummed with controlled chaos. Sailors hunched over glowing screens while others plotted intercept courses on massive plotting boards. The air conditioning couldn't keep up with the heat generated by dozens of electronic systems and sweating men, but Morrison barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the green sweep of his radar display and the radio chatter crackling through his headphones. "Bogies, bearing 270, range 60 miles and closing fast," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the din. Count 40 plus aircraft inbound." The date was October 12, 1944, and Task Force 38 was about to face the largest coordinated air attack the Japanese had mounted since the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot 4 months earlier. Admiral Halsey's fast carriers had been pounding Formosa for 2 days, preparing for General MacArthur's upcoming invasion of the Philippines. The Japanese, desperate to halt American momentum in the Pacific, had assembled every available aircraft on Formosa and neighboring airfields. What followed would be remembered as one of the most decisive air battles of the Pacific War. Morrison had been tracking aircraft movements for 36 hours straight, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. The 25-year-old radar officer from Toledo, Ohio, had joined the Navy fresh out of college in 1942, drawn by the promise of working with the latest electronic warfare technology. He'd never imagined he'd become the eyes and ears for hundreds of American fighters locked in mortal combat above the Formosa Strait. "All stations, this is Intrepid CIC." Morrison spoke into his microphone. "Vector blue flight to Angels 20, bearing 285. Heavy bogey formation approaching from the west. Estimate 40 to 50 bandits." The response crackled back immediately. "Blue leader to Intrepid, roger that. We see them now. Holy mother of, there's a whole sky full of them." Through the ship's speakers, Morrison could hear the distant thunder of aircraft engines as the combat air patrol climbed to meet the incoming threat. On the flight deck above, the controlled pandemonium of launching additional fighters added to the symphony of war. Deck crews in colored jerseys sprinted between aircraft, fuel hoses snaked across the deck, and the steam catapults hurled F-6F Hellcats into the morning air with bone-rattling precision. Captain John "Blackjack" Sullivan, the Intrepid's air group commander, appeared at Morrison's shoulder. The 28-year-old pilot from Boston had already flown 2 missions that morning, his flight suit still damp with sweat and his face marked by the imprint of his oxygen mask. Sullivan was a natural leader, the kind of pilot who could thread a Hellcat through a typhoon and still have enough composure to crack jokes over the radio. "What's the picture, Radar?" Sullivan asked, using Morrison's nickname earned from his uncanny ability to read the electronic tea leaves. "Bad news, Skipper. This isn't like yesterday. They're coming in coordinated waves, multiple altitudes. Look here." Morrison pointed to his scope where several distinct formations showed as bright blips. High cover at 25,000, main strike at 15,000, and what looks like torpedo bombers coming in on the deck. They're not just throwing everything at us piecemeal anymore. Somebody over there knows what they're doing. Sullivan nodded grimly. The previous day's action had been fierce but disorganized, with Japanese aircraft arriving in small groups that were easily overwhelmed by superior American numbers and coordination. This was different. This looked like a well-planned, maximum-effort attack designed to cripple or sink several American carriers. "How long until they reach the outer screen?" Sullivan asked. Morrison glanced at his plot. 20 minutes, maybe less if they're really pushing it." "Get me Admiral Mitcher," Sullivan ordered one of the radiomen. Within seconds, he was connected to the task force commander aboard the USS Lexington. "Admiral, this is Sullivan aboard Intrepid. We've got a massive raid inbound, coordinated attack, multiple waves. Request permission to launch everything we've got." The reply was immediate and decisive. "Launch everything, Jack. Every fighter, every bomber that can carry air-to-air ordnance. This is what we came here for." Morrison watched his scope as American fighters began streaming off FedEx of 4 fleet carriers. The Intrepid, Franklin, Lexington, and Bunker Hill were launching aircraft as fast as their catapults could cycle. Within minutes, over 100 Hellcats were climbing toward the incoming Japanese formation, with more launching every 30 seconds. "Blue Flight, this is radar," Morrison called out, vectoring the lead squadron. "Your bogies are now bearing 290, range 40 miles. They're in a tight formation, probably zeros with some twin-engine jobs mixed in. Angels 20,000. Blue leader copies. We're climbing through 15,000 now. Can you give us a course to intercept?" Morrison quickly calculated vectors, wind drift, and closure rates. "Come left to heading 310. You should have visual in 8 minutes. As he worked, Morrison was acutely aware that every decision he made, every vector he called, would determine whether American pilots lived or died. The responsibility was crushing, but there was no time to dwell on it. His scope was filling with contacts as the Japanese formation approached and more American fighters climbed to meet them. "Red Flight. This is radar," he called to another squadron. "I'm showing a low group of bogies, probably torpedo bombers, bearing 300, range 35 miles, Angels 500. They're trying to sneak in under the high fight." "Red leader, roger. We're diving to intercept." Through his headphones, Morrison could hear the chatter from dozens of American pilots as they maneuvered for position. The disciplined radio procedure of the launch was giving way to the urgent calls of pilots in combat. "Tally-ho! Zeros at 2 o'clock high. I've got 3 Ks coming in low, engaging. Break right, break right. You've got one on your tail." Morrison's job was to maintain the big picture, to see the battle as a 3-dimensional chess game played at 300 miles per hour. His radar could track friend and foe alike, but identifying which blips were American and which were Japanese required constant communication with the pilots and careful monitoring of known flight paths. "Intrepid CIC. This is Hornet CIC," came a call from another carrier. "We're tracking a second wave of bogies bearing 340, range 70 miles. Count 30-plus aircraft." Morrison's blood ran cold. A second wave meant this wasn't just a maximum effort attack. It was a carefully planned operation designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers and coordination. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at Task Force 38, and they were doing it right. "Copy, Hornet. I see them now." Morrison marked the new contacts on his scope. "Looks like they're timing it so the second wave hits just as our cap is running low on fuel." It was a classic tactic, one that required precise timing and excellent intelligence about American operations. The fact that the Japanese had pulled it off suggested they were more desperate and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Captain Sullivan had been monitoring the radio chatter, and his expression was grim. "They're really rolling the dice this time," he said. "If this attack fails, they won't have much left to defend Formosa. And if it succeeds?" Morrison asked. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, listening to the reports flowing in from the air battle now raging 60 miles to the west. "If it succeeds, we could lose half the fleet. This is their best shot at stopping us before we hit the Philippines." Morrison nodded and turned back to his scope. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was now in contact with American fighters, and his screen was alive with the electronic signatures of aircraft maneuvering at high speed. Each blip represented someone's son, husband, or father locked in mortal combat 5 miles above the Pacific Ocean. "All stations, this is Intrepid CIC," Morrison announced. "Multiple air battles in progress. First wave is engaged, second wave inbound. All available aircraft launch immediately. This is not a drill," as if anyone could mistake the thunder of combat above for anything else. The first American Hellcats reached the incoming Japanese formation at 0847 hours, 43 miles northwest of the task force. Lieutenant Bobby "Hawk" Henderson, leading Blue Flight from the Intrepid, spotted the enemy formation first, a sight that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. "Mary and Joseph," Henderson breathed into his radio. "Radar, this is Blue Leader. I count at least 50 bandits in formation. Zeros, Kates, and what looks like some of those new George fighters. They're spread out over 5 miles and stacked from 10,000 to 25,000 feet. From his position in the Combat Information Center, Morrison could hear the apprehension in Henderson's voice. The 22-year-old pilot from West Virginia had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in previous battles. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the largest coordinated air attack Japan had mounted in months. Blue Leader. This is radar. Morrison responded, his voice steady despite the tension. You've got red and yellow flights coming up on your right flank, green and white flights climbing from below. Wait for them to get into position before you engage. But the Japanese had other plans. Break. They're diving on us. Henderson's calm demeanor shattered as a formation of Zeros peeled off from the main group and dove toward the approaching Hellcats. All flights, the dance is on. Morrison watched his scope as the orderly formations dissolved into a swirling melee of individual aircraft. Friend and foe became impossible to distinguish as planes maneuvered violently, trying to gain position for a killing shot. His job now was to track the overall battle and vector fresh fighters toward areas where American pilots were outnumbered. Red flight, this is radar, he called out. Blue flight is engaged with the main body. You've got a group of torpedo bombers trying to sneak around to the south. Bearing 270, Angels 1000. Red Leader copies. We see them now. Looks like 8 or 10 Kates with zero escort. Going down after them. High above the main battle, Lieutenant Commander Tom Ice Kowalski led Yellow Flight in a diving attack on the Japanese high cover. The 26-year-old Hellcat pilot from Chicago had learned his trade the hard way, surviving the chaotic early days of the Guadalcanal campaign when American pilots were still learning how to fight the nimble Zero. Now, 18 months later, he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Pacific Fleet. Yellow Flight, this is Yellow Leader, Kowalski called out as he rolled his Hellcat into a steep dive. Remember your training. Don't try to turn with the Zeros. Use your speed and your guns. Hit them hard and get out. The Hellcat had been specifically designed to counter the Zero's advantages. While the Japanese fighter could out-turn and out-climb the American plane, the Hellcat was faster in a dive, more heavily armed, and much more survivable. American pilots had learned to use these advantages, avoiding turning fights in favor of high-speed slashing attacks that played to their aircraft's strengths. Kowalski selected his target, a Zero flying top cover for the main formation, and closed to 300 yards before opening fire. His 6.50 caliber machine guns converged in a deadly cone of fire that shredded the lightly built Japanese fighter. The Zero's wing folded, and the aircraft tumbled out of control, trailing smoke and debris. Splash 1-0, Kowalski called out, already looking for his next target. But the Japanese pilots weren't going down without a fight. The Zero that had been flying alongside Kowalski's victim rolled into a tight turn and came after the American pilot. Kowalski saw the muzzle flashes from the Zero's guns and felt his Hellcat shudder as 20mm cannon shells struck his aircraft. Yellow Leader taking hits, he called out, fighting to control his damaged fighter. Port wings shot up pretty bad. Yellow 2, I've got him, came the response from Kowalski's wingman, Ensign Mike Torres. The young pilot from Los Angeles had only been with the squadron for 6 weeks, but he'd already proven himself a natural gunner. Torres lined up behind the Zero that was pursuing his leader and fired a long burst that caught the Japanese fighter in the engine. The Zero nosed over and went straight into the ocean. Meanwhile, Morrison was tracking the progress of the torpedo bombers that Red Flight was pursuing. The Nakajima B-5NK torpedo bombers were the greatest threat to the task force, but they were also the most vulnerable. Loaded down with heavy torpedoes and flying low and slow, they depended entirely on their Zero escorts for protection. Red Leader, this is radar, Morrison called out. Your torpedo bombers are 30 miles out now, heading straight for the task force. You need to break them up before they reach the outer screen. Red Leader copies. We're going in now. Lieutenant Jim Bulldog Patterson led Red Flight in a head-on attack against the torpedo bombers. The 24-year-old pilot from Texas had earned his nickname for his tenacious refusal to break off an attack once he'd comitato it. Now facing 8 Kate bombers and their Zero escorts, Patterson's aggression would be put to the ultimate test. Red Flight, this is Red Leader, Patterson called out. We'll take the torpedo bombers head-on. Ignore the Zeros and concentrate on the Kates. They can't hurt us if they don't reach the ships. The head-on attack was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aerial combat, but it was also one of the most effective against enemy bombers. By attacking from directly ahead, American fighters could bring all their guns to bear while presenting the smallest possible target to enemy gunners. Patterson selected the lead Kate and opened fire at 800 yards, walking his tracers up toward the approaching bomber. The Japanese pilot held his course, depending on his rear gunner to drive off the American fighter. But the single 7.7mm machine gun in the Kate's rear cockpit was no match for 6.50 caliber guns firing from directly ahead. Patterson's bullets smashed through the Kate's engine and cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. The bomber nosed over and crashed into the ocean in a geyser of spray and flame. Patterson pulled up sharply, narrowly avoiding a collision with the wreckage. Behind him, the rest of Red Flight was having similar success. Within minutes, 6 of the 8 torpedo bombers had been shot down, with the remaining 2 jettisoning their torpedoes and fleeing toward Formosa. The immediate threat to the task force had been eliminated, but the cost was high. 2 Hellcats from Red Flight had been shot down by the Zero escorts, and a third was limping home with severe damage. Morrison tracked the survivors as they turned back toward the carriers. Red Leader, this is radar. Vector 180 for recovery. You did good work out there. Red Leader copies, Patterson responded, his voice tired. But there's more coming. I can see another group of aircraft forming up over Formosa. Morrison looked at his scope and felt his stomach drop. Patterson was right. The second wave of Japanese aircraft was beginning to take shape, and it looked even larger than the first. Worse, many of the American fighters were already running low on fuel and ammunition after the first engagement. All stations, this is Intrepid CIC, Morrison announced. Second wave forming up over Formosa. All available aircraft launch immediately. First wave aircraft are cleared for emergency recovery. Captain Sullivan appeared at Morrison's shoulder again, his face grim. How many did we get in the first wave? Morrison consulted his plot, mentally tallying the splash calls he'd heard over the radio. Best estimate, we shot down 35 to 40 Japanese aircraft. But we lost 8 Hellcats, and several more are too damaged to fly again today. And the second wave? Morrison looked at his scope, where a new formation of contacts was building over Formosa. Looks like they've got at least as many as the first wave, maybe more. And our pilots are tired, Skipper. They've been flying combat missions for 3 days straight. Sullivan nodded. Get me Admiral Mitcher again. Within seconds, Sullivan was connected to the task force commander. Admiral, we've broken up the first attack, but there's a second wave forming. We need to rotate some fresh squadrons into the fight. Already on it, Jack, came Mitcher's reply. I'm launching everything Lexington and Bunker Hill have got. Your boys did good work on that first wave. As if to emphasize the point, a formation of Hellcats from the Lexington roared overhead, climbing toward the northwest to intercept the second Japanese attack. Morrison counted 16 aircraft in the formation, their engines straining as they climbed toward combat altitude. But even as fresh American fighters joined the battle, Morrison could see on his scope that the Japanese were adapting their tactics. The second wave was approaching from multiple directions, forcing him to split the American fighter cover and making it harder to achieve the kind of overwhelming local superiority that had been so effective against the first attack. This is going to be a long day, Morrison muttered, adjusting his headset and preparing for the next phase of the battle. On the flight deck above, aircraft handlers were working frantically to refuel and rearm the fighters returning from the first engagement. Many of the Hellcats showed battle damage, bullet holes in wings and fuselages, shattered canopies, and oil leaks from damaged engines. But the pilots climbing out of their cockpits were already asking when they could get back into the fight. The first round had gone to the Americans, but the battle for Formosa was far from over. By 10:15 hours, the second wave of Japanese aircraft was approaching from 3 different directions simultaneously. Morrison's radar scope looked like a 3-dimensional puzzle with enemy formations converging on Task Force 38 from northwest, northeast, and due west. The Japanese had learned from their first attack, abandoning the single massive formation that had been relatively easy to intercept in favor of multiple smaller groups that would be much harder to stop. All stations. This is Intrepid CIC, Morrison announced, his voice betraying none of the tension he felt. We have multiple bogey formations inbound. designating them Raid 2 Alpha, 2 Bravo, and 2 Charlie. 2 Alpha bearing 340, range 50 miles, count 20-plus aircraft. 2 Bravo bearing 010, range 45 miles, count 15-plus aircraft. 2 Charlie bearing 270, range 40 miles, count 25-plus aircraft. Captain Sullivan, who had been monitoring the tactical situation from the bridge, had returned to the CIC as the complexity of the attack became apparent. "They're trying to saturate our defenses," he observed. "Force us to spread our fighters thin so at least one group gets through." Morrison nodded. His attention focused on coordinating the American response. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple. If the Japanese could get even one group of torpedo bombers through to the task force, they could cripple or sink a carrier. The Americans had to stop all 3 attacks, which meant splitting their fighter strength just as the enemy intended. "Green flight, this is radar," Morrison called out. "Vector 010 to intercept Raid 2 Bravo. You've got 15 bogeys at Angels 12,000. Green leader copies," came the response from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Viper Chen, one of only 3 female pilots in the entire Pacific Fleet. The 25-year-old aviator from San Francisco had transferred from transport duty 6 months earlier, over the violent objections of several senior officers who believed women had no place in combat aircraft. She'd since shot down 4 Japanese planes and earned the grudging respect of even her harshest critics. Viper had gotten her nickname not for any particular aggressiveness, but for her uncanny ability to appear out of nowhere and deliver a fatal strike before her enemies knew she was there. Flying a specially modified Hellcat with extra fuel tanks, she often operated far from the main force, picking off stragglers and disrupting Japanese formations. "Green flight, form up on me," Chen ordered as she led her 4-plane division toward the northeastern threat. "Remember, these guys learned something from the first wave. They're not going to make it easy for us." She was right. As Green flight approached Raid 2 Bravo, Chen could see that the Japanese formation was much more compact than the earlier attack, with the bombers tucked in close to their fighter escorts. There would be no easy head-on passes against isolated torpedo bombers this time. "Green flight, this is Green leader," Chen called out. "I count 12 Kates with 6-0 escorts. They're in tight formation, so we'll have to go through the fighters to get at the bombers. Green 3 and 4, you take the high zeros. Green 2, you're with me on the bombers." Chen rolled her Hellcat into a shallow dive, using her altitude advantage to build up speed for a slashing attack. The Japanese formation was flying at 8,000 feet, heading directly for the heart of Task Force 38. If they maintained their current course and speed, they would reach torpedo launch position in 12 minutes. The Zero escorts spotted the approaching Hellcats and turned to meet them, but Chen was ready for the maneuver. Instead of engaging the fighters, she dove beneath them, heading straight for the torpedo bombers. Her wingman, Ensign Tommy Rodriguez from New Mexico, followed close behind. "Green 2, target the lead Kate," Chen ordered. "I'll take the number 2 bomber." The head-on attack developed with frightening speed. At a combined closing velocity of over 500 miles per hour, Chen Haydenly seconds to line up her shot and fire before the aircraft flashed past each other. She opened fire at 600 yards, her 6 machine guns stitching a line of tracers toward the lead Kate bomber. The Japanese pilot saw the attack coming and tried to evade, but the heavily loaded torpedo bomber was too slow and cumbersome to avoid Chen's fire. Her bullets smashed through the Kate's engine and cockpit, and the bomber rolled over and dove straight into the ocean. Rodriguez, following close behind his leader, had equal success with the second Kate. His burst caught the bomber in the fuel tank, and it exploded in a brilliant orange fireball that momentarily blinded both pilots. But the Zero escorts were already diving after the 2 Americans, and Chen found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse as she tried to escape the pursuing fighters. The Zero was faster in a climb, but the Hellcat had the advantage in a dive. Chen pushed her throttle forward and dove toward the ocean, using her aircraft's superior diving speed to open the range. "Green leader, you've got 2 zeros on your tail," called out Green 3, Ensign Pete Williams. "I'm coming down to help." "Negative, Green 3, Chen replied, still diving hard toward the water. "Stay with the bombers. Don't let them reach the ships." Williams reluctantly obeyed, turning his attention back to the remaining Cape bombers. But the brief exchange had allowed several of the Japanese aircraft to break through the American screen, and they were now only 20 miles from the outer ring of destroyers that surrounded the carriers. Meanwhile, Morrison was tracking the other two Japanese formations as they approached from different directions. The carefully coordinated attack was putting enormous strain on the American defenses, forcing him to make split-second decisions about where to deploy his limited fighter resources. "White flight, this is radar," he called out. "Raid 2 Alpha now bearing 350, range 30 miles. They're heading straight for Lexington. You need to intercept them before they reach the screen." "White leader copies," came the response from Major Jake Hammer Thompson, a Marine pilot flying off the Bunker Hill. The 29-year-old veteran from Georgia had been flying combat missions since Guadalcanal, and his weathered face showed the strain of 2 years of continuous fighting. "We're climbing to 20,000 now. Should intercept in 8 minutes, but 8 minutes might be too long." The Japanese formation-designated Raid 2 Alpha was making better time than expected, and Morrison could see that they would reach attack position before White Flight could intercept them. "All stations, this is Intrepid CIC," Morrison announced. "We have a leak in the northern sector. Raid 2 Alpha will reach attack position in 6 minutes. Any available fighters vector 350 immediately." The response came from an unexpected source. "Radar, this is Blue Leader. Blue Flight just finished refueling. We're launching now and can intercept 2 Alpha." Morrison felt a surge of relief. Lieutenant Henderson and his wingman had somehow managed to land, refuel, rearm, and launch again in less than 30 minutes, a testament to the skill of the deck crews and the determination of the pilots. The 4 Hellcats climbed rapidly toward the northwest, racing to intercept the Japanese bombers before they could reach the task force. But the 3rd Japanese formation, Raid 2 Charlie, was approaching from due west and was already within 20 miles of the task force. This group appeared to be the largest of the 3, with at least 25 aircraft, including both high-level bombers and torpedo planes. "Black Flight, this is radar," Morrison called out. "Raid 2 Charlie is your responsibility. They're coming in low and fast from the west. Range 18 miles in closing." "Black leader copies," came the response from Lieutenant Commander Rick Iceman Kowalski, Tom's younger brother who flew off the Franklin. The family resemblance extended beyond their looks to their flying style. Both brothers had a reputation for remaining cool under pressure and making difficult shots look easy. "Black Flight, form up on me," Rick ordered. "We're going in low and fast. These guys are probably carrying torpedoes, so we need to get them before they reach launch position." The Kowalski brothers had developed a friendly rivalry over who could shoot down more Japanese aircraft, but today there was no time for competition. Rick led his 4-plane division in a high-speed approach that would bring them into contact with Raid 2 Charlie just as the Japanese bombers reached their attack positions. As the various air battles developed simultaneously across 100 square miles of ocean, Morrison found himself functioning as both air traffic controller and tactical coordinator. His radar scope showed the positions of over 60 aircraft engaged in multiple dogfights, and he had to constantly update pilots on threats they couldn't see while vectoring fresh fighters toward developing situations. "Green leader, this is radar," he called out. "You've got 3 Kates that got past you, bearing 180, range 12 miles from the task force. They're heading for Intrepid." Chen's voice came back immediately, strained from the G-forces of combat maneuvering. "Green leader copies. I'm engaged with 2 zeros, but I'll try to break free and pursue." "Negative, Green leader," Morrison replied. "Continue your engagement. Porcupine Flight will handle the leakers." Porcupine Flight was the last-ditch defense, 4 Hellcats that had been held back specifically to intercept any Japanese aircraft that broke through the outer defenses. Led by the ship's most experienced pilot, Commander Bob Ace McKenzie, these 4 fighters were the final barrier between the Japanese bombers and the American carriers. As the multiple air battles raged around the task force, Morrison was acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine the outcome of not just this engagement, but possibly the entire Pacific War. If the Japanese succeeded in sinking even one American carrier, it would be their greatest victory since Pearl Harbor and might give them the breathing room they desperately needed to prepare their defenses for the American invasion of the Philippines. But if the Americans could repel this massive coordinated attack, it would break the back of Japanese air power on Formosa and clear the way for MacArthur's forces to land on Lake. The stakes couldn't be higher, and everything depended on the skill and courage of the pilots now locked in mortal combat above the Philippine Sea. All flights, this is radar, Morrison announced. Multiple bogies have penetrated the outer screen. This is it, people. Time to earn your pay. The response that came back over the radio was a chorus of acknowledgments from pilots who knew they were fighting for more than just their own lives. They were fighting for the future of the Pacific War. At 10:47 hours, the battle reached its crescendo as all three Japanese formations simultaneously pressed their attacks home. Morrison's radar scope had become a nightmare of intersecting tracks as over 80 aircraft maneuvered violently across the sky above Task Force 38. The orderly formations that had characterized the opening phases of the battle had dissolved into dozens of individual dogfights, each one a life-or-death struggle between skilled pilots pushing their aircraft to the absolute limits of performance. Multiple contacts inbound, Morrison called out, his voice cracking slightly from the strain. All stations, we have leakers in every sector. This is a general engagement. 3K torpedo bombers from Raid 2 Bravo had somehow slipped past green flight screen and were now only 8 miles from the Lexington, boring in at wave-top height with their deadly fish armed and ready. Commander Mackenzie's Porcupine flight was racing to intercept them, but the mathematics of time and distance suggested it would be a very close thing. Porcupine leader, this is radar, Morrison called out. Your bogies are bearing 090, range 6 miles, angels 50 feet. They're going for Lex. Porcupine leader copies, came Mackenzie's calm reply. The 32-year-old pilot from Montana had been flying combat missions since the Doolittle raid, and his voice betrayed none of the urgency of the situation. I have visual on the Kates. Going in now. Mackenzie rolled his Hellcat into a steep dive, trading altitude for the speed he would need to catch the torpedo bombers before they reached launch position. At 400 miles per hour, he closed rapidly on the trailing cape, but the Japanese pilot saw him coming and began weaving desperately from side to side. The torpedo bomber's rear gunner opened fire with his single 7.7mm machine gun, the muzzle flashes winking in Mackenzie's windscreen. But the small caliber weapon was no match for the Hellcats' armor, and Mackenzie pressed his attack home. At 200 yards, he opened fire with all 6. 50 caliber guns, the convergent streams of bullets tearing the Kate apart. The bomber exploded in a geyser of flame and debris, its torpedo detonating sympathetically and sending up a waterspout that drenched Mackenzie's fighter. But the other 2 Kates were still boring in toward the Lexington, now only 4 miles away and well within torpedo range. The massive carrier was turning hard to port, trying to present a smaller target. But the 27,000-ton ship could only maneuver so quickly. Porcupine, too. Take the left, Kate, Mackenzie ordered. I've got the right one. Ensign Danny Morrison, no relation to the radar officer, Mackenzie's wingman, rolled in on the left-hand torpedo bomber just as it began its attack run. The young pilot from Idaho had only been with the squadron for 3 weeks, but he'd already shown promise as a natural marksman. Now, with the lives of 3,000 sailors hanging in the balance, Morrison had to make the most important shot of his life. The Kate pilot released his torpedo at 2,000 yards, the standard launch distance that would give the weapon time to arm and stabilize before striking its target. The torpedo splashed into the water and began its run toward the Lexington, its wake clearly visible in the blue water. Morrison opened fire at maximum range, his bullets reaching out toward the fleeing Kate. His first burst fell short, splashing into the ocean behind the bomber. He adjusted his aim and fired again, this time walking his tracers up toward the aircraft. The Kate shuddered as bullets struck its port wing and engine, but the bomber kept flying. Come on, Morrison muttered, firing his third and final burst at the damaged bomber. This time his aim was true, and the Kate's engine exploded in a gout of flame and smoke. The bomber nosed over and crashed into the ocean just 1,500 yards from the Lexington. But Mackenzie was having trouble with the third torpedo bomber. The Kate pilot was more experienced than his wingman, and he used every evasive maneuver in the book to throw off the American fighter's aim. Mackenzie fired burst after burst, but the Japancephaled's violent maneuvering made a clean shot impossible. The Kate reached its launch point and released its torpedo, the long lance weapon splashing into the water and beginning its deadly run toward the carrier. From the Lexington's bridge, Admiral Mitcher watched the torpedo's wake approach his flagship, knowing that the next 60 seconds would determine whether Task Force 38 remained an effective fighting force. "Hard a starboard," the carrier's captain ordered. "All ahead flank." The Lexington turned as sharply as its massive hull would allow, but the torpedo was running hot, straight, and normal toward the carrier's starboard side. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as though the weapon would strike home. Then, at the last possible second, the torpedo passed harmlessly astern, missing the carrier's fantail by less than 50 yards. A cheer went up from the sailors lining the carrier's flight deck, but there was no time to celebrate. Raid 2 Alpha was now pressing its attack against the northern edge of the task force, while Raid 2 Charlie was approaching from the west with nearly 30 aircraft. "White flight status report," Morrison called out. "White leader here," came Major Thompson's reply. "We're engaged with the northern group. Count 15 Vals and 8 zeros. We've splashed 4 bombers, but the Rister's still coming through. We need help up here." Thompson's Hellcat had taken several hits from Zero fighters, and his port aileron was responding sluggishly. The Marine pilot was an old hand at aerial combat, but even his experience couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of being outnumbered 2-1. His 3 wingmen were similarly engaged, each fighting individual battles against multiple opponents. "Help is on the way." "White leader," Morrison replied. "Blue flight is climbing to assist." But Blue flight was still 5 minutes away, and the Japanese dive bombers were already rolling into their attack dives on the carrier's Bunker Hill in Franklin. The D-3A Val dive bomber might have been obsolete by 1944 standards, but in the hands of experienced pilots, it was still a deadly accurate weapon. Lieutenant Commander Henderson, leading the reformed Blue flight, pushed his Hellcat to its limits as he climbed toward the developing attack. His aircraft still showed battle damage from the morning's earlier engagement, bullet holes in the wings, and a cracked canopy that whistled ominously at high speed. But Henderson and his 3 wingmen were determined to reach the dive bombers before they could complete their attacks. "Blue flight, this is Blue leader," Henderson called out. "We've got Vals rolling in on our flat tops. Forget the escort fighters, go for the bombers. We can't let them hit the carriers." The 4 Hellcats arrived just as the first Japanese dive bombers were pulling out of their attacks. 2 Vals had already released their bombs at the Franklin, and Henderson could see the weapons falling toward the carrier like deadly raindrops. The ship was turning hard and firing every anti-aircraft gun it had, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Henderson selected the nearest Val as it pulled out of its dive and opened fire from long range. His bullet struck the bomber's port wing, tearing chunks of aluminum from the aircraft structure, but the Val kept flying. The Japanese pilot was good. Using every evasive maneuver, he knew to throw off the American fighter's aim. Below them, the first bomb struck the Franklin's flight deck with a tremendous explosion that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. The second bomb hit the forward elevator, blowing a hole completely through the flight deck and into the hangar bay below. Secondary explosions followed as aviation gasoline ignited, sending pillars of black smoke rising from the wounded carrier. "Franklin's been hit," came the report from the task force flagship. "She's burning but still operational." Henderson's second burst caught the fleeing Val in the engine, and the bomber began trailing smoke and losing altitude. The Japanese pilot attempted to make it back to Formosa, but his damaged aircraft couldn't maintain level flight. The Val struck the ocean at high speed, cartwheeling across the surface before disappearing beneath the waves. But even as Henderson and his wingmen engaged the dive bombers, the largest Japanese formation, Raid 2 Charlie, was approaching from the west with nearly 30 aircraft. This group included both high-level bombers and torpedo planes, a devastating combination that could overwhelm the American defenses through sheer numbers. Lieutenant Commander Rick Kowalski was leading Black Flight in a desperate attempt to break up the western attack, but his 4 Hellcats were facing impossible odds. The Japanese formation was well coordinated, with experienced pilots who had learned from the failures of the earlier attacks. "Black flight, this is Black leader," Kowalski called out. "We've got 20-plus bogies bearing 270, mixed Kates and Bettys. They're in good formation, so we'll have to hit them hard and fast." The Mitsubishi G4M Betty medium bombers were particularly dangerous because they could attack from high altitude with armor-piercing bombs or come in low with torpedoes. Their heavy defensive armament made them difficult targets, and their long range allowed them to operate far from their bases on Formosa. Kowalski led his flight in a head-on attack against the bomber formation, hoping to break up their coordination and force them to jettison their weapons. But the Japanese were ready for this tactic, and the Betty bombers' forward-firing guns opened up as the Hellcats approached. The air between the opposing formations filled with tracers as dozens of machine guns and cannons fired simultaneously. Kowalski felt his aircraft shudder as 20mm shells struck his port wing, but he held his course and opened fire at 400 yards. His 6.50 caliber guns converged on the lead Betty, and he saw pieces of the bomber's nose section break away under the impact of his bullets. But the Betty was a tough aircraft, designed to absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. Despite the damage, the bomber maintained its course toward the American carriers, its pilot grimly determined to complete his mission. Kowalski's wingman, Ensign Pete Santos from California, had better luck with his target. His burst caught a Kate torpedo bomber in the fuel tank, and the aircraft exploded in a fireball that momentarily blinded both pilots. The explosion was so violent that fragments from the destroyed bomber damaged Santos's Hellcat, forcing him to break off his attack. "Black 2 is hit," Santos reported. "I'm losing oil pressure and my engine's running rough. I need to head home." "Roger, Black 2, Kowalski replied. "Good shooting." Black 3, close up and cover Black 2's withdrawal. That left only 2 Hellcats to deal with the remaining bombers, now less than 15 miles from the task force. The Japanese formation had lost several aircraft to the American attack, but nearly 20 bombers were still pressing toward their targets. Morrison, monitoring the situation from the Intrepid CIC, realized that the Western attack was going to succeed unless something dramatic happened. The mathematics were inexorable. 2 fighters could not stop 20 bombers, no matter how skilled the pilots or how obsolete the enemy aircraft. "All stations, this is Intrepid CIC," Morrison announced. "We have a massive raid approaching from the west. All available fighters vector 270 immediately. This is a flash red situation." Flash red meant that enemy aircraft had penetrated the outer defenses and were threatening the carriers directly. It was the highest priority alert in the Navy's tactical manual, and it galvanized every pilot within range into action. The response came from an unexpected source. "Radar, this is Turkey Flight from Essex. We just launched and are climbing to assist. ETA 5 minutes. Turkey Flight consisted of 8 F-6F Hellcats from the carrier Essex, which had been operating independently about 50 miles to the south. The formation had been launched as soon as their ship's radar detected the massive Japanese attack developing, and now they were racing north to help defend Task Force 38. But 5 minutes might be too long. The Japanese bombers were now within 10 miles of the outer screen of destroyers, and some of them were already beginning their attack runs. Morrison could see on his scope that the formation was splitting up, with the torpedo bombers dropping to wave-top height while the high-level bombers climbed to their attack altitude. All ships, this is Intrepid CIC," Morrison broadcast on the fleet frequency. "Multiple bogies inbound from the west. Take evasive action and commence anti-aircraft fire." The response was immediate and spectacular. Every ship in Task Force 38 opened fire simultaneously, filling the sky with a curtain of flak that looked like a deadly thunderstorm. The 5-inch guns off the destroyers and cruisers fired timed shells that exploded at predetermined altitudes, while the 40mm and 20mm guns on the carriers provided close-in defense. The first Japanese bomber to enter the flak zone was a Kate torpedo plane flying at 200 feet above the ocean. The aircraft flew directly into a wall of 40mm fire from the destroyer Healy and simply disintegrated. The explosion was so violent that the debris rained down on the destroyer's deck, damaging several gun mounts. But other Japanese aircraft made it through the flak and began their attack runs on the carriers. A Betty bomber flying at 12,000 feet released 6 250-kilogram bombs at the Intrepid, the weapons falling toward Morrison's ship in a tight pattern that would be difficult to avoid. From his position in the CIC, Morrison couldn't see the attack developing, but he could hear the ship's anti-aircraft guns firing directly overhead. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunder that made communication almost impossible. Through his headphones, he could hear Captain Sullivan on the bridge directing the ship's evasive maneuvers. Hard a port. All ahead flank. The Intrepid heeled over sharply as it turned to avoid the falling bombs. Morrison grabbed his plotting table to keep from being thrown across the sea as the massive carrier executed a turn that would have been impressive for a destroyer. The ship's 150,000 horsepower engines drove it through the water at over 30 knots, and the skilled ship handling of the captain and his crew saved them from destruction. 5 of the 6 bombs missed, raising huge waterspouts alongside the carrier. But the 6th bomb, the last one released, struck the Intrepid's flight deck just aft of the island superstructure. The explosion blew a hole 20 feet across in the wooden flight deck and started fires in the hangar bay below. "We're hit," came the report from the bridge. "Flight deck damaged, fires in the hangar bay. Damage control teams responding." Morrison felt the deck shudder beneath his feet as the bomb exploded, but the CIC's armored bulkheads protected the radar operators from the worst of the blast. Emergency lighting flickered on as the ship's electrical system automatically switched to backup power, and Morrison could hear the sound of running feet as damage control teams raced to fight the fires. But there was no time to assess the damage. More Japanese aircraft were pressing their attacks, and Morrison's job was to coordinate the defense of the entire task force. He forced himself to ignore the sounds of battle around him and concentrate on his radarscope. "Turkey flight, this is radar," he called out. "Where are you?" "We need help immediately." "Turkey leader here," came the reply. "We're 10 miles south, climbing through 15,000. We can see the smoke from your ship. We're coming as fast as we can." 10 miles might as well have been 100. At that moment, Morrison realized that Task Force 38 was facing its greatest crisis since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. If the Japanese succeeded in sinking or severely damaging several American carriers, it would be their greatest victory of the Pacific War and could change the entire course of the conflict. Everything now depended on the skill and courage of a handful of American pilots and the accuracy of the task force's anti-aircraft gunners. The next few minutes would determine whether American naval aviation remained a dominant force in the Pacific, or whether Japan would gain the breathing room it desperately needed to prepare for the final battles ahead. The climax of the Formosa air battle came at 11:23 hours, when the surviving Japanese aircraft made their final, desperate attacks on the American carriers. Morrison's radar scope showed a chaotic swirl of contacts as the last enemy bombers pressed through the wall of anti-aircraft fire that surrounded Task Force 38. The mathematics of aerial warfare had reached their inevitable conclusion. Despite suffering catastrophic losses, enough Japanese aircraft had survived to pose a mortal threat to the American fleet. "All stations, this is Intrepid, CIC," Morrison announced, his voice steady despite the fires burning on his own ship. "We have multiple torpedo bombers in the final attack phase. All available fighters engage immediately." Turkey flight from the Essex finally arrived at the critical moment. 8 fresh Hellcats diving into the melee just as the surviving K torpedo bombers began their final approach runs. Lieutenant Commander Dave "Shotgun" Williams, Turkey flight's leader, assessed the tactical situation in seconds and made the kind of split-second decision that separated great combat leaders from merely good ones. "Turkey flight, this is Turkey leader," Williams called out. "Forget formation flying. Pick your targets and engage at will. These guys are almost at launch position." The 8 Hellcats scattered across the sky, each pilot selecting a different Japanese bomber for attack. The resulting air battle was less a coordinated engagement than a series of individual duels fought at point-blank range above the American fleet. Williams himself went after a Kate that was boring in on the damaged Intrepid, the torpedo bomber flying so low that its propeller was throwing up spray from the wave tops. The Japanese pilot was skilled and determined. holding his course despite the wall of anti-aircraft fire that surrounded the American carrier. At 1,000 yards from the Intrepid, the Cape pilot released his torpedo. Williams, attacking from directly astern, opened fire at the same moment, his 6 machine guns converging on the bomber's engine. The Cape exploded just as its torpedo splashed into the water, the bomber's debris raining down on the ocean surface. But the torpedo was running hot and true toward the Intrepid. From his position in the CIC, Morrison could hear the ship's captain ordering emergency maneuvers, but the massive carrier was already committed to a turn and couldn't change course quickly enough to avoid the weapon. "Torpedo in the water," came the lookout's cry from the bridge. "Bearing green 45, range 800 yards. Morrison felt helpless as he listened to his ship's final moments potentially unfolding above his head. The Intrepid was already damaged from the bomb hit, and a torpedo strike could prove fatal. Everything now depended on the skill of the ship's helmsman and the courage of the men who might have to fight the resulting damage. The torpedo passed directly beneath the carrier's keel, missing by less than 10 feet. A collective sigh of relief went up from the crew, but there was no time to celebrate. Other Japanese aircraft were still pressing their attacks, and the battle was far from over. Lieutenant Commander Rick Kowalski, still leading what remained of Black Flight, was engaged in a running battle with the last formation of Betty medium bombers. The Japanese aircraft were approaching from high altitude, intending to make precision bombing attacks on the American carriers. Kowalski's single remaining wingman, Ensign Rodriguez, was low on fuel and ammunition, but both pilots were determined to break up the enemy formation. Black leader to Black 4, Kowalski called out, "We'll make one more pass at the Bettys, then we have to head home. We're both running on fumes." "Roger," Black leader Rodriguez replied. "I've got maybe 30 seconds of ammunition left." The 2 Hellcats climbed toward the approaching Betty formation, using their last reserves of fuel to gain the altitude advantage they would need for their final attack. Kowalski could see that there were 6 bombers in the Japanese formation, flying in a tight V formation that would make them difficult to break up. At 15,000 feet, Kowalski rolled into his attack dive, with Rodriguez following close behind. The Betty bombers saw them coming and began evasive maneuvers, but the heavily loaded aircraft couldn't maneuver as effectively as fighters. Kowalski selected the lead bomber and opened fire at 400 yards, his remaining ammunition converging on the Betty's port engine. The engine exploded in a gout of flame and smoke, and the bomber rolled over and entered a steep dive toward the ocean. But the other 5 Bettys continued their approach, and Kowalski was out of ammunition. He was forced to watch helplessly as the Japanese bombers approached the release point over the Lexington. Rodriguez made a desperate attack on the second Betty, firing his last 30 rounds at point-blank range. His bullets shattered the bomber's cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. The Betty nosed over and followed its leader into the ocean, but 4 bombers were still approaching the American flagship. At that critical moment, the remaining pilots of Green Flight arrived on the scene. Lieutenant Commander Chen had finally disentangled herself from her dogfight with the Zero escorts and was leading her 3 surviving Hellcats in a high-speed attack on the Betty formation. "Green Flight, this is Green Leader," Chen called out. "We'll take them head-on. Everyone pick a target and fire at maximum range." The 4 Hellcats approached the Betty formation from directly ahead, a tactic that maximized their firepower while minimizing their exposure to the bomber's defensive guns. At 600 yards, all 4 American pilots opened fire simultaneously, their combined 24 machine guns creating a cone of fire that no aircraft could survive. 3 of the 4 remaining Bettys were destroyed in the head-on pass, exploding in brilliant fireballs that lit up the sky. The 4th bomber, severely damaged but still flying, jettisoned its bombs harmlessly into the ocean and turned back toward Formosa. As the last Japanese aircraft fled the scene, an eerie quiet settled over Task Force 38. The sounds of battle, the roar of aircraft engines, the chatter of machine guns, the thunder of anti-aircraft fire gradually faded away, leaving only the normal sounds of a fleet at sea. Morrison looked at his radar scope and saw something he hadn't seen in over 2 hours. No hostile contacts. The Japanese attack was over, and somehow, incredibly, the American fleet had survived. "All stations, this is Intrepid CIC," Morrison announced. "Radar screen is clear. No hostile contacts. The attack appears to be over." The response came from Admiral Mitcher himself, speaking from the bridge of the Lexington. "Well done, all hands. Preliminary damage reports indicate all carriers are still operational. We'll conduct a full assessment once we've recovered our aircraft." Over the next hour, as American fighters returned to their carriers and damage control teams fought fires and repaired battle damage, the true scope of the Japanese defeat became apparent. Morrison, working with radar operators from other ships, began compiling the final tally of the battle. The Japanese had launched approximately 230 aircraft in their desperate attempt to cripple Task Force 38. Of those, only about 30 had returned to their bases on Formosa. The rest, over 200 aircraft, had been shot down by American fighters or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. It was a catastrophic loss that effectively ended Japanese air power on Formosa and cleared the way for the American invasion of the Philippines. American losses, while significant, were far lighter. 18 fighters had been shot down, with 12 pilots rescued by destroyers and submarines. 3 carriers had suffered damage, the Intrepid from a direct bomb hit, the Franklin from 2 bomb hits, and the Bunker Hill from near misses, but all remained operational and capable of conducting flight operations. Captain Sullivan found Morrison in the CIC as the radar officer was finishing his battle damage assessment. The captain's uniform was stained with smoke and his face was haggard from the strain of commanding a ship under attack, but his expression was one of quiet satisfaction. "How many did we get, radar?" Sullivan asked. Morrison looked up from his plotting table, where he had been tallying the confirmed kills reported by American pilots. "Conservative estimate, Skipper. We shot down at least 180 Japanese aircraft, maybe as many as 200. It's the biggest one-day loss they've suffered since the Marianas." Sullivan nodded slowly, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "And our boys, 18 fighters lost, but most of the pilots were picked up. We lost some good people, but nothing like what the Japanese lost." As if to emphasize the point, the sound of aircraft engines filled the air as the last of the American fighters returned to their carriers. On the Intrepid's damaged flight deck, crews were already working to repair the bomb damage so that normal flight operations could resume. Lieutenant Commander Henderson was among the pilots climbing out off their cockpits after the longest day of their lives. His Hellcat showed the scars of multiple engagements, bullet holes in the wings, a cracked canopy, and oil stains from a damaged engine. But Henderson himself was uninjured, and his logbook would show 4 confirmed kills for the day's action of a thing. Henderson said to his crew chief as he completed his post-flight inspection, "They threw everything they had at us, and we burned it all down." It was a sentiment shared by pilots throughout the task force. The Japanese had made their maximum effort to stop the American advance across the Pacific, and they had failed catastrophically. The road to the Philippines and ultimately to Japan itself was now wide open. Morrison remained at his post for another 2 hours, monitoring the skies around Task Force 38 as the fleet resumed its advance toward the Philippines. His radar scope showed only friendly contacts now, American patrol planes and fighters maintaining their vigilant watch over the damaged but victorious fleet. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded everyone of the fires that had consumed so many Japanese aircraft that day, Morrison finally allowed himself to relax. The battle for Formosa was over, and American naval aviation had achieved one of its greatest victories. The statistics would be analyzed and debated by historians for decades to come, but the essential facts were undeniable. In a single day, Japan had lost the equivalent of an entire air fleet, while the Americans had suffered relatively light casualties. The balance of air power in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of the United States, and the final phase of the Pacific War could now begin. Morrison removed his headset and rubbed his tired eyes. In 12 hours, he had helped coordinate the destruction of Japanese air power on Formosa and probably shortened the war by months. It had been the longest day of his life, but also perhaps the most important. Outside the Intrepid's armored hull, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, peaceful now, but still holding the secrets of the 200 Japanese aircraft that had vanished beneath its waves. They had thrown everything they had at the American fleet, and Task Force 38 had indeed burned it all down. The road to Tokyo lay open ahead.